I think a lot about the spelling bee scene from Deltarune. A small child rendered paralyzed and frozen by the mere utterance of December. I can only imagine what went through her head at that moment, and yet I sense I know exactly what it was. Nothing at all. An emptiness. And yet an emptiness that still held weight as, were life to be fair, God to be good, that space would not be empty. If destiny was anything but cruel, the word would conjure up memories of sipping cocoa around the fire, opening presents and posing for pictures, hearing that beat-up old guitar play everything from the latest punk anthem to acoustic James Taylor when Azzy was over and Des thought Noelle was asleep. It's an oppressive contradiction, that darkness and silence can cripple you like the most blinding light or deafening roar, that you can stand proud with your chin up, take everything that life throws at you, and then be crushed by nothing. I wonder how Noelle would react were that spelling bee to be held these days. It's been years since Des disappeared, since she could attach new memories of her sister to the word, since she still had all of her old memories, sad as that is to admit. And December isn't an uncommon word. It's a sizable percentage of the year. And what's more, it's a month of the year that's often romanticized. Children dream of December. There are countdowns to it, songs singing its praises to the heavens, even in households where Christmas isn't year-round. Does it still paralyze Noelle as it once did? Does it provoke even a lump in her throat anymore? And if Noelle has moved on enough that she can say no, has heard the word enough that she's been able to overcome the trauma, would that mean Des, her absence, means less to her now? Is it disrespecting Des to not miss her so much you can't move whenever you're reminded of her? Is it disrespecting those memories, the infinite value she added to her life and to life itself, that she's capable of moving on? If Noelle went into Des's room every year on her birthday and stayed up all night talking to her until she broke down wailing, and one year she didn't because she was out having fun with her friends, would there be any shame or guilt at that? If she heard Des's favorite songs on the radio and sang along instead of tearing up, if she could go on vacation and be so content she forgot to wish Des was there with her, is that tantamount to forgetting her? What does it mean to move on? A question that, in trying to answer it, provokes a lot of additional questions about what it means to mourn, to miss, even, in a sense, what it means to die and what it means to live. I can't speak for Noelle, but I can speak for her parents, and they would rather kick, scream, die, kill, do anything possible to do by creatures of this earth than move on, and that's something they take pride in. Happy December. My name is Trenton. I'm a student of political science and government, and someone who was raised by Undertale Let's Plays, comic dubs, and theories. I'm someone who remains enraptured by Toby Fox's work to this day. I always strove to break into the fandom space myself, but outside of role-playing on some forums back in the day, I never truly contributed anything to the Undertale or Deltarune zeitgeist. That changed a few months ago, when I published my grand video essay debut, Rudy Knight Theory, an overview, which did fairly well. 5,000 views in 3 days, and steadily rising, exponentially rising at that. I felt the need to respond to each and every comment. Thank you so much for your time and attention to the positive ones. I'm so sorry for disappointing you to the negative ones. One negative comment too many, and I just took the whole thing down. If there was ever a decision I've regretted. Be that as it may, I haven't stopped thinking about the video and the arguments I presented in it since all that went down. I've been ruminating on the thesis from that video and considering its implications. And with Deltarune Chapter 5's hype cycle beginning in earnest, as we're now well into the fabled plot-important month, I figured it's time to remake that old video, and buff it up with some additional ideas I've had. Some which make the theory make a whole lot more sense, and some which are even further off the wall. Holiday Requiem theory has two main theses. The first is that Rudy Holiday is the Roaring Knight, and the Knight's conspiracy is a quest he and Mayor Kara Holiday are engaged in to free December Holiday from her tomb in the Dark World. The second main thesis is that Deltarune is building towards a confrontation with the Holidays, an anguishing climactic battle that'll be the culmination of Deltarune's plot and themes. These theses feed into each other but are not joined at the hip. I still believe in the potential of a climactic holiday duel, even if that duel involves Des as the Roaring Knight. Consider both theses separately, but consider both carefully. What I hope to prove no matter what is that Deltarune is, at its core, a story about grieving parents willing to tear reality asunder for a chance to bring their daughter back, all while everything continues to crumble around them as a result of their grief and sorrow. Fully integrating Deltarune's themes of escapism and grief into the core plot, while also recontextualizing Deltarune as an escalation of Deltarune's themes regarding what loss can shape somebody into. In particular, the loss of a child, and the loss of life's innocence. My argument will first examine Death Knight, the prevailing fandom headcanon, and why I do not believe it is the best direction to take Deltarune's themes in, which will also include an analysis of what I believe those themes will end up being. I'll then progress into analyzing the Knight's conspiracy itself, and what I believe the driving motivation behind said conspiracy to be. I'll then allot a significant chunk of time to analyzing the evidence for Rudy Holiday's participation in the conspiracy, up to and including him being the Knight, it taking up so much space as a way to justify all the hours I've put into refining my arguments. I'll then conclude by providing a vision for how Deltarune's future chapters could play out, considering the narrative and thematic seeds I believe Deltarune chapters 1 through 4 have planted. It doesn't need to be said, but this isn't a definitive list of expectations or, God forbid, demands. I'm not even 100% confident the story will go in this direction, and I won't be disappointed if it goes in another. I love this game too much to even say something in that stratosphere, and if I'm wrong, I'll be wrong extremely happily. Just because I can't see how something will work doesn't mean it won't or can't work. With that out of the way, onwards and upwards. I don't necessarily agree with the notion that Death Knight can't be the ultimate conclusion the story is building to, because that'd be too obvious. I often converse with my younger nephew about Deltarune. He's played the game on his Switch, he's watched DanTDM play it, but he doesn't engage with the fandom. He doesn't watch theory videos, he doesn't browse forum threads. When I asked who he thought the Knight was, he shrugged his shoulders, and when I asked him to think back to the Knight's design, their helmet shape, the antlers, and see if he could draw any conclusions from that, his eyes widened and he delightfully exclaimed, "Asgore." I asked him if it could potentially be Des instead, and he replied to me, straight-faced, "Who's Des again?" I have no statistics for this, but I would hazard a guess and say this is a more sizable percentage of the Deltarune player base than anybody might assume. If you're seeking out this video in the first place, you likely possess more significant knowledge about the game than a large number of people who love it and its characters. Des to them isn't a red herring. Des to them isn't even an idea. She's just a background character who's been mentioned 2 or 3 times and hasn't been given any depth beyond that. This reveal, were it to be the reveal, would come out of left field and flabbergast, utterly dematerialize the expectations of countless players. Des is only too obvious if he were in an environment full of people who overanalyze every detail, up to and including messages hidden within the game's code. And even then, subverting expectations wouldn't be an inherent good anyway. Subversion is only good insofar as it serves a purpose and is more effective than the alternative. Oftentimes, another way to phrase a plot point being obvious is that the plot is naturally building towards that conclusion, and these are disparate concepts. If the story is best served by Des being the Knight, then the story is best served by Des being the Knight. It's also worth mentioning that in its purest state, Deltarune would not be theorized over. This game was never intended to be experienced episodically, and that was not in Toby Fox's vision, and this is not how future generations will experience Deltarune. This is not what its legacy will be. There are reasons to believe Death Knight. While there is less direct evidence implicating her as implicating others, the evidence that is there is harder to come up with alternative explanations for. I do believe that there are also reasons to doubt Death Knight, but I want to engage with the theory in good faith and treat it, and its believers, with the respect that they deserve. Consider this tangent as my attempt to do so. Now, to get into the reasons why I don't believe Death Knight is as compelling as others do. The motivations. In developing Deltarune, Toby Fox started with the ending and worked backwards. He started from a conclusion and figured out what needed to happen in order to make it so. This means that he can be uniquely trusted to have put thought, care, and intentionality into character progressions and motivations. By nature of Toby Fox working backwards, we can uniquely trust that what we're seeing are parts of a greater whole, are bricks in a grand staircase pointing up. Which is why I find it impossible to believe that the Knight's motivation has not been set up yet. but as it stands, we are clueless as to what that motivation could be in a Death Knight scenario. We are giving nothing to go off of. If there are hints, they're so obfuscated and obtuse as to barely be called foreshadowing, since no one has put together a compelling case for what exactly the Knight wants, assuming the Knight is Death. It is stated in text that the Knight could bring about the roaring at any time, which indicates that the roaring is a risk the Knight is willing to take and not means to an end, or a desirable end in and of itself. And even if it were, what reason would Death have to destroy the world? Until such time as I'm able to get a satisfying answer to this, grounded in what the game has set up, and it appears that the setup portion of the plot has concluded, I can't throw my wholehearted support behind Death Knight. There are two different variations of Death Knight theory, and I find neither satisfying. They're mutually exclusive, but that makes the fact that there's evidence for both simply confusing. These are Lucid Death Knight and Feral Death Knight. Lucid Death Knight postulates that Death is completely conscious and aware within that suit, supported by her retaining her apparent cocky and rebellious personality, being capable of understanding and responding to speech if her interactions with Susie are any indication, and taking deliberate, calculated actions to avoid detection and make some kind of impression on Chris by knighting them. Feral Death Knight postulates that by nature of being stuck in the code, or a dark world, or both, or by being influenced by some nebulous entity, Death corrupted and lost her ability to engage with reality as it exists. This explains why the Knight is beastly, dangly, and drooling and roaring, why it never speaks, and why it has properties we've never seen any other Lightner or Darkner possess. Feral Death Knight makes the most sense for why she's going around opening dark worlds for unclear reasons. She's either unable to comprehend her actions or simply carrying out actions on a whim, or blindly executing on the prophecy's demands depending on how much you believe Gaster is involved with this whole mess. But Feral Death Knight is less substantiated than Lucid Death Knight. Death can drool and roar and fly without being feral, but she can't think and communicate and plot without some degree of lucidity. There's also the messages in the code which are probably set in present day if you believe she's speaking to the player. Messages which are written by Death apparently in a clear state of mind. So Lucid Death Knight has to be true to a certain extent assuming Death Knight. But if that's the case, again, what does she want? And how have we blown past the entire setup portion of the plot without figuring that out, without even having an idea? The theory in the middle is semi-lucid Death Knight theory, that Death still retains some degree of lucidity but has lost her mind and become megalomaniacal. Basically, this theory just posits, remember Flowey, it's Flowey again. But even then, Flowey was eventually revealed to have been driven mad by the loss of his sibling and desperate to control the world because he was able to control so little about life prior to his corruption. If Death is an analog for anybody in Deltarune though, it's Kara and not Flowey. Condemned to a life beyond the understanding of mortals while their loss lingers in the land of the living, and becomes the catalyst for everybody else's desperate actions. I just don't see it. If she's trying to go back home, then why doesn't she just go home, given that it seems like the Knight can travel between the light and dark worlds at will? If she's corrupted in some way and trying to get back to her original form, then what's the relationship between that goal and opening more fountains? And if she's just mad and wanting to destroy the world, then we Ouroboros back to the beginning and ask, then why doesn't she just destroy the world already? And in any case, we ask, what's the purpose of involving other people in this conspiracy, especially her own family? The numerous questions and lack of satisfying explanations for either of them makes me doubt the potential of Death Knight itself to be satisfying, and as somebody who trusts in Toby Fox's vision, that thus makes me doubt in the probability of Death Knight being in that vision. Perhaps he'll surprise me, but until he does, I can't find as much power and emotion in Death Knight as I can in other theories. Discourse regarding the conspiracy itself also feeds into this. The conspiracy is a grand plan involving countless actors, rifts between dimensions, the power of a human soul, gods and monsters, and potentially a confrontation of Deltarune's existence as a game. This could not have been put together without careful thought, planning, and intention, which again makes us ask why? Questions that Death Knight does not provide answers to. There are also variations of the conspiracy which can be split into two camps. There's the Plus Knight conspiracy and the Minus Knight conspiracy. The Plus Knight conspiracy proposes that the Knight has a direct hand in the conspiracy that Carol and Chris are engaged in, and is opening Dark Worlds with their knowledge and counsel, then collaborating with them to accomplish some kind of greater goal. This is supported by their seemingly blatant collaboration with Chris in both the Light and Dark Worlds, Chris having access to the shelter which the Knight appears to be dwelling in, and Carol knowing the location of when the next Dark Fountain is going to be opened. The Minus Night conspiracy proposes that Carol has insider information for some reason completely independent of being in on it, and that her and Chris are engaged in a plan to stop the Night rather than help it, which could explain why the Night is opening Dark Worlds only for Chris to close them for unclear reasons. This is also an easier pill to swallow if you believe the Night is feral and doesn't have the machinations to engage in any kind of elaborate scheme. A Minus Night conspiracy, though, is almost impossible to jive with some of the earlier direct collaborations we see between Chris and the Night, unless you believe there's a double truces situation going on here where Chris is collaborating with both sides without the other's knowledge. But that just doubles the questions about motivations instead of resolving them. That said, Minus Night conspiracy is also preferred by many because Plus Night conspiracy and Death Night are almost impossible to take together. It appears that there is a search for deaths going on behind the scenes that has led many of Deltarune's main characters to darker, yet darker places. Asgore has a corkboard in his room that implies that some conspiracy consumed him, and his firing from the police force and subsequent dissolution of his family are implied to be because his search for answers led him into darkness that his family could not believe existed, or accept if they did. There are few other explanations other than that the conspiracy which consumed Asgore was the search for deaths. She's the missing daughter of his best friend, and this is a quiet town where so few things happen, where the police chief has so little to do other than direct traffic. Given that the Holidays have a similar conspiracy corkboard in their bedroom, it seems obvious to me that they're also involved with the conspiracy, and even more obvious that this conspiracy is a search for their missing daughter. Carol specifically seems to be very closely involved. She can be easily read as suffering from extreme grief given her controlling attitude towards Noelle, preservation of Dessa's room and belongings, and her burying herself in her work. It can be easily assumed that Carol was just as taken by misery after Dess disappeared and just as desperate to bring her home. The connections between this conspiracy and the Knight's conspiracy are obvious. There are two conspiracies, two plans that brush up against darkness and the secrets of the universe, which both involve the exact same figures. The conclusion is as obvious. The Knight's conspiracy is related to the search for Dess, and they are very likely one and the same. How then are you supposed to take together the Knight being involved in the conspiracy and Death Knight? Carol can't be searching for her missing daughter if her missing daughter is right there, and if Dess is corrupted and the conspiracy is about returning her to her original form, then again, what's the relationship between that goal and opening more fountains, especially if they know that a potential side effect of that is destroying the world? And again, the Knight apparently has a form in the light world and are lucid up to a point, so it's possible that Dess, our favorite tomboy reindeer, can just come and go and live life as normal under this interpretation, which makes you wonder what about that isn't good enough for her or her family. Minus Night conspiracy and Death Knight taken together make a little more sense. They're searching for Dess, they found her, now they need to snap her out of whatever mysterious funk she's in. But again, that forces you to ask, how did Carol know where the next dark fountain was going to be opened? Why is Dess not returning home to her family if she can do so at any time and clearly appears to want to if the messages in the code are any indication? Granted, it's possible that the messages are set in the past and Dess got eaten by a cat or something right after writing this, but we Ouroboros back to the beginning. What does Dess want? What do Carol, Chris, Asgore want? What does anyone want? Death Knight makes all these questions extremely hard to answer without an anime-style monologue where the Knight explains their backstory and a motivation we've never heard of before, and finds some way to recontextualize everything that happened previously, using information we can't have possibly previously known. There are so many ways to look at the Knight, and it requires backflips upon backflips to make Death Knight make sense from a narrative standpoint, even if all the direct evidence is there. If you assume that the conspiracy is about finding Dess, and that the Knight isn't Dess, but rather a part of the search for her, then the pieces fall into place a lot more organically. It explains how the conspiracy got started, how and why it intersects with Dark Worlds, and what everybody's role is in it. Under this interpretation, Dess gets lost in a Dark World, the agents of the conspiracy discover Dark Worlds, the Knight opens Dark Fountains to look for Dess, and then Chris closes them to make sure nobody else gets lost in them, or the roaring doesn't begin. This explanation raises a few questions about specific actions we see the Knight take, kidnapping Toriel and Undyne for instance, or making a Titan only for it to be defeated and sealed, but I'm confident it's at least a major component of their plan. I'm more comfortable accepting that everything else will be explained later on than I am accepting that the core underlying motivation for half the characters in the game has just not been set up yet. It's simple yet complex enough to be the bedrock of a really compelling story, as we can all trust Deltarune will be. The Knight's conspiracy is a noble quest to find and bring back a missing girl, and the destruction of both realms by way of the Roaring is a risk that the desperate folks engaging in it are willing to take because they love Des that much and are that unable to cope with her disappearance. We hear Des's cries in the code. We hear her getting hopeful that somebody is coming to find her. There are two options for how to interpret this, and thus two options for where this story could be going. The first is that Des is out there, waiting to be found. The second is that the person Des hears approaching her, the scratching she hears getting closer, is not us, but rather somebody who kills her, and what we are hearing are echoes from the past. This is the saddest option, but it's potentially the most pertinent to Deltarune's themes of moving on and overcoming grief, and not letting escapism distract you from genuine growth. Des isn't just lost under this interpretation. She's dead, and the Knight and the gang are doing all of this in vain, bringing about nothing but further pain and suffering, tearing themselves and their lives apart to a greater and greater extent because they can't let her go. They can't move on. They can't. A noble goal, but only to a point. At some point, they're doing nothing but rendering themselves unable to grieve as Des deserves, and begin to rebuild themselves as Des would have wanted from them. Whether it's Asriel or Kara, they don't come back at the end of Undertale. That's not what the game was about. Undertale was about how the inability to move on can destroy one's inner and outer worlds, can destroy reality itself, and the happiest ending, despite everything, was to walk away, to tell Asriel that Kara's not coming back, that life can't go back to how it was, that you can't focus on creating a new life until you accept that, and then to walk away from him too, accepting that you can't change history, no matter how determined you may be. And that's okay too. That's an arc that Deltarune's main characters would be well served by going on. They're all their own varieties of being unable to move on, and it's easy to see how that consuming them could literally consume them, and create the Knight. So, who is the Knight? If this truly is the plot of Deltarune, I don't think that truly matters in the grand scheme of things. Everybody's struggling to process this in their own way. Everyone's the Knight. But who's behind the mask? Under the helmet? Chris's vision about the Knight removing said helmet implies that there is indeed something to see underneath it, but what? What did Chris object to us finding out? Or alternatively, what didn't they want to face? Well, when you look at Deltarune through the lens I have presented, that question seems easier to answer. If Des isn't the Knight, suspicion falls back onto Carol. She is, after all, a central figure in this conspiracy, and appears to be the mastermind of it if her controlling nature in all facets of her life is any indication. She was a swordswoman back in the day, and the Knight is very skillful and artistic wielding a blade. She has a black one in her room that Asgore seems to refer to as the Black Shard, which is the name of the blade that breaks off from the Knight's sword at the end of Chapter 3. Her conflict with Susie seems to be particularly tense, as is the conflict between Susie and the Knight, with Susie mocking the Knight throughout Chapters 3 and 4 and getting mocked right back. She's also as possessive over Chris as the Knight seems to be. She has all the means and motive in the world. The question, however, is her opportunity. She was visibly in her house, chewing out Noelle, when the church Darkworld was supposedly being created, and the Knight was searching around in it, prior to ducking into the church's closet for cover. This is a relatively small detail in the grand scheme of things, and may be an oversight all things considered, but it's small enough for me to doubt that the Knight, at least the Knight as we see them in Chapter 4, more on that later, is Carol Holiday. Furthermore, Carol, from a personality standpoint, doesn't seem hammy enough to aura farm and laugh in Susie's face. She seems the type to work behind the scenes with a frown, a wrinkled lip, and a sneer of cold command. She gives orders and others carry them out. She bosses Asgore around. She bosses Noelle around. She bosses Chris around. She literally bosses the entire town around. She's a boss, a commander. I'm not certain she would get her hands dirty in the way we see the Knight get their hands dirty, or that she would even have the time to personally search through Dark Worlds given all her other responsibilities. But if the antlered Knight that's depicted as a deer in the Shadow Mantle minigame isn't Des Holiday or Carol Holiday, then it seems the only suspect by process of elimination is Rudy Holiday. She's the brain and he's the brawn. He appears to have no alibi for creating any of the Dark Worlds. The hospital is closed off in Chapter 4. You are also prohibited from accessing the hospital in Chapter 2, when the knight is implied to have been in the library's closet. Still, Rudy's bedbound status has kept him in 3rd place for knight theories, and I would call him a fairly distant 3rd place. Even Papyrus Knight may have more dedicated supporters than Rudy Knight. His bedbound status I'll discuss in greater detail later, but I want to preempt one criticism of Rudy Knight theory right off the bat. Yes, he is an optional character who you do not have to interact with at any point in the game, which, remembering back to my opening rant about the casual player base of Deltarune, could mean he's not being set up to be that plot important. However, I must point out that the same can be said for other characters who have gained or likely will gain plot importance in the future. Undyne is the clearest example in my head, and for the most important characters, Toby seems to be taking the route of giving them required scenes shortly before their importance becomes evident. We saw this with Noelle getting a required scene at the beginning of Chapter 2, and Asgore getting a required scene at the beginning of Chapter 4. Carol has had exactly one scene thus far, and she's integral to everybody's interpretation of Deltarune's plot progression. It's beyond possible for Rudy to get a required scene in early Chapter 5, potentially one at the festival where he keels over and has a heart attack, as many people believe the plot is building towards. As it stands, I believe Rudy is absolutely going to gain greater plot significance. He's the only member of the Holiday family who exists at an arm's length from the game's progression. He's not even a tertiary character as it stands, despite all the fertile ground that he presents and represents. It'd be a storytelling faux pas to not give him greater involvement, to not till that ground. He lost his daughter just as Carol did, a daughter he clearly loves more than life itself. His grief, his anguish, whatever actions he took then and is taking now to look for her. There's little reason to not explore these given how Dessa's disappearance appears to be the event at the center of Deltarune's plot. A satisfying telling of that plot requires greater involvement from Rudy than can currently be claimed, and trusting Toby Fox means trusting him to execute on all the potential that he himself imbued within this character. Before we delve into the possibility of Rudy Holiday himself wielding the Black Katana, I want to explain why I'm positive he's involved with the Knight's conspiracy to at least some extent, as that's the foundation I'm going to build everything else from. Carol and Rudy share a room. Noelle specifically calls the upstairs room her parents' room. Parents, plural, meaning that everything in Carol's room would be easily accessible and in plain sight to Rudy, including the Black Katana and the conspiracy corkboard. That'd be brazen, bold, and simply idiotic for the secretive Carol if Rudy already wasn't privy to that information. We admittedly don't know how long Rudy has been living at the hospital. I've seen some people state that Rudy doesn't sleep in his and Carol's room and hasn't in some time since Carol only has one pillow on the bed. However, context clues such as the freshly bloomed flowers and recently signed card tells me that Rudy's institutionalization is a fairly recent development. I'm also going to hazard a guess and say that the corkboard has been up since Des disappeared, since that's the point of having a corkboard. You collect and connect the information as it becomes available. And Birdley's spelling bee flashback tells us that Noelle, as a little girl, already had some trauma regarding Des's name, meaning that Des has likely been missing for years. And assuming that Rudy's disappearance in Tenna's flashback is roughly around the time that he went into more intensive care, this was several major life events removed from Des's disappearance. Rudy and Carol were definitely still sharing this room at least when she disappeared, and if the corkboard went up then Rudy was very likely aware of it, and if he objected to it, he didn't object to it strong enough to get it moved from literally right next to the bed. His involvement is also probable thematically. It's possibly implied that he and Carol don't have the best relationship, him mentioning that he disagrees with Carol's parenting style with regards to Noelle, and correcting Toriel when she calls her his wife. There's no evidence that they divorced, but this could mean that their separation has happened emotionally and they're only kept together by outside circumstances. Maybe Noelle, or maybe his health, or maybe this conspiracy. Or maybe Rudy's still deeply in love with Carol and was just offended that Toriel wouldn't call her by her name, as I've seen in other interpretations. Either way, it's inconceivable that Carol wouldn't at least keep her husband of 2 decades informed about a search for their daughter. If there's one shared value they likely have, it's a deep love for Des and a deep sorrow that she's gone. Neither one of them have likely been able to get over it. The conspiracy corkboard in their shared room could further indicate that their conclusions about what happened to her, and the plans that emerged out of those conclusions, were concocted together and potentially executed on together. If you want more direct evidence that Carol and Rudy are in on it together, when Toriel chastises Carol for continuing to support Asgore's you-know-whats, presumably whatever shady actions he's taking to find Des, Talking to Rudy has him use the pronoun we instead of her in reference to that support. This seems to imply that Rudy is not just aware of what Carol is doing, he is in support of it and actively participating in it to whatever his ability. Rudy is also close with many of the other major figures in the conspiracy in a way that nobody else really is. He's still held in high regard by everybody involved. He's one of the most respected and beloved men in all of Hometown. The 3 shelter codes, the Deltarune, the police badge, and a Christmas tree, seemingly signify the 3 holders of those codes: Father Alvin at the church, Mayor Carroll, and the chief of police, who is undying now but was Asgore. Rudy is the mayor's husband, the former chief of police's best friend, and he's a regular churchgoer, actually attending services unlike Carol or Asgore. As a brief aside, Spamton's mention of communion right before bringing up the knight further ties the knight to the church, and really only Rudy seems religious out of the major suspects. Him attending church on Sunday, pressing the point when others think he's too weak, may also be recontextualized here as him scoping out the church in anticipation of making a dark world there. Back to the main point, if there is a conspiracy between the mayor, the chief, and the church, Rudy is the through line that could keep all of those disparate groups with great tension and little in common, together. Asgore's engagement in the conspiracy hasn't really been discussed because it seems like he's not in on it like the main players are. He's potentially come to his own conclusions in his basement instead of being looped in by Carol since he has his own conspiracy corkboard. But we know that Carol and Rudy are still enlisting his help to some extent because of the dialogue in the church, and I find it hard to believe that Carol would even keep Asgore around without Rudy's insistence. They have a testy relationship, with Carol often snipping at Asgore and even threatening to evict him from his home. It's possible that Asgore was as invested in the case to begin with because his best friend since college had requested his assistance, because he saw how distraught Rudy was and thought it was his responsibility, given his position, to assist. Rudy had been bringing Des over to the Dreamer since she was probably in diapers. He's the source of Asgore's investment in finding Des Holiday. Meanwhile, Alvin's relationship to the conspiracy is debatable, but his great conflict over retrieving the hammer suggests he was pressured into it by an outside entity, which implies it was a component of the conspiracy for Gerson to resurrect. A plausible reason the conspiracy would want Gerson to resurrect was so he could defeat the Titan, further evidence that causing the roaring isn't the conspiracy's intention, but that's unrelated. This was a monumental ask, something that Alvin would not do of his own recognizance. It would take someone close to him to convince him of the value of doing such a thing. Rudy is a regular churchgoer and even sits in the front row, closest to Alvin, in the one service we see. Someone like Rudy, who likely turned to Alvin and the church when Des disappeared and has been coming ever since, who grieves her as Alvin grieves Gerson, who knows Alvin would be agreeable if Rudy frames it as necessary to bring back his lost loved one, as Alvin so desperately longs for his father back. A father grieving his child and a child grieving their father. A match that perfectly explains how Alvin got involved with this whole mess to begin with. And now, let's look at Chris. How Chris got tangled up in the conspiracy is also debatable. There are theories positing that they accidentally killed Des or otherwise got her lost, and are now engaging in the conspiracy to gain penance for that, either in the eyes of others or in the eyes of themselves. Modern fandom consensus does believe that the Tale of Hell lured Des into the woods and kidnapped her then. However, Chris is said to have been involved in satanic activity, potentially still lending this theory credence if you want to assign a responsibility complex to Chris. This jives with how Carol seems to have Chris under her thumb. That "you are welcome here anytime" is likely not in reference to the teen in the striped shirt, but rather to the soul, us. Chris is useful to her because of this soul, not of their own merit. Tying this back to Rudy, there's a scene that plays out in an art therapy clinic where Chris potentially went after some kind of violent outburst, given the dialogue of the therapist and other mentions of Chris having had violent intrusive thoughts. This scene features Chris at a sink being unable to wash a graphite stain off their hands from a pencil they were holding. The more they try, the worse the stain gets, potentially representative of them, physically and metaphorically, not being able to wash their hands clean of the mess they made, of the problem they started, and every time they try, it just gets worse. Tying back to this scene, Rudy has unique dialogue if you interact with the sink in his room. I don't think he'd be callous enough to mock Chris for their guilt, but the thematic connection is still prevalent and ties the mess that Chris feels like they have to clean up to make up for to Rudy. Diving into their relationship a bit deeper, if Chris has anything to feel guilty over, Rudy appears to have forgiven them wholeheartedly. He cares deeply for Chris. He gives them a nickname and teases them, and appears to be the member of the Holiday family Chris holds in the highest regard. Chris hadn't spoken to Noelle in a good long while before the events of the game, but Chris still signed the Get Well Soon card that was delivered to Rudy. Tenna's flashback tells us that even after Des disappeared, Toriel and Asgore divorced, and Noelle and Chris stopped being friends, Rudy remained a part of the Dreamer's inner circle. He and Chris have happy memories together, inside jokes, and if there's an adult in this town, any single one, Chris can trust, it's him. He even takes offense at Chris not being as friendly to him as usual, which makes him one of the few characters to note out loud that Chris is acting differently. This may represent him in real time feeling sad for what Chris is going through regarding the soul. If Carol is the stern, ice-cold one that makes people feel like they have to help her, Rudy is the warm and jovial one that makes people want to help. What makes Rudy a believable knight is that he is loved. The Knight's conspiracy is a horrific, horrific burden to bear. The people involved are asked to make terrible sacrifices within their own lives and within the lives of those they love, up to and including their values, morals, and senses of self. It's the kind of plan that's unthinkable on paper, that's even more unthinkable in execution, the kind of plan that requires a figure like Rudy to get and keep everyone on board. They'll do it for Des, and they'll do it for the father who they know and care about too much to abandon him in this time of desperate need. The Knight, from a personality standpoint, also seems to match Rudy more than any other candidate. The Knight is hammy, they orofarm up the stairs, they laugh at Susie, they just genuinely seem to enjoy what they're doing. Carol, who I would assume would treat this affair as solely professional, I doubt would act like that. Rudy, meanwhile, who enjoys gallows humor and teasing, making himself laugh on numerous occasions, could easily be imagined doing all that and more. Now, Rudy is weak in the light world. He is sick. But it's possible that being the Knight alleviates that sickness. The Knight is shown with an open ribcage with something in their chest, potentially representing that Rudy has room to breathe as the Knight, which he doesn't have in the light world, since it appears his illness is respiratory. Being the Knight reinvigorates him, gives him strength and health which he hasn't had in years, power which he could never imagine. He'd likely want to take advantage of that as much as possible. The Knight being able to fly, and exclusively flying, would also be notable under this interpretation since walking is clearly a massive strain for Rudy. He'd enjoy that opportunity more than anything. Note, too, that in Chapter 4, when Rudy is at its weakest, the Knight never directly engages with the fun gang, instead running, flying away at every instance, and creating distractions. There are also further visual and thematic connections between the Knight and illness. There are several lines of flavor text stating that simply being around the Knight makes the fun gang feel sick. You felt your chest twisting, you felt a migraine coming on, your heartbeat becomes twisted, etc. Furthermore, the Knight can also be seen drooling on multiple occasions, making it easy to say that the Knight has a sickly appearance. I've also seen the interpretation that these are tears, that the Knight is crying, something that would be perfectly understandable if the Knight was a grieving parent searching for their daughter. While I find it unlikely that being the Knight is the cause of Rudy's sickness, as other Rudy Knight truthers have suggested, the numerous references to illness during the Knight fight make the parallels easy to draw. On that subject, Rudy is very notably bedbound, but it's possible that before this, he was a very strong monster, and may still be in spite of his illness. On multiple different occasions, with Chris, with Susie, and when discussing Birdley and Sans, Rudy threatens to, quote, kick their ass. And on other occasions he jokes about busting out of the hospital. He even calls himself Asgore's main man, and Asgore is one of Hometown's strongest monsters. Rudy's bravado, swagger, and joking attitude make it possible that these are just exaggerations, hyperbole, but such confidence would also befit a genuinely strong monster who won a lot of fights in his younger days, and who still maintains that fiery, ferocious spirit. And while the evidence for this is purely circumstantial, some have been led to believe that that spirit could stem from a glorious past, that the bed and the illness are hiding a man whose strength once put Hometown on the map. Knowing a lot about politics and government, I have often asked myself how the Holidays can afford that mansion and the lavish estate that they have. It's possible they just come from money, but that mansion looks too new, too sleek, too polished to be a 100-year-old family manor. I have a feeling this was built by the Holidays' own hands, and fairly recently, which tells me that this money can't have been accumulated over that long a time span. But where'd it come from then? Small-town mayors barely get paid anything. Most mayors in lesser populated areas don't even do it full-time. And if Carol had a legal career before a political career, as many politicians do, then small-time lawyers don't get paid mansion money either. We don't know Carol's previous occupation. She could have been a CEO, someone who flipped a startup perhaps, but you don't tend to see such industries based out of small New England villages. One possibility that's been proposed is that one of the Holiday parents, this theory favors Rudy, was a professional athlete prior to returning to their hometown and using their newfound riches to set their family up for life. Professional athlete is one of those few occupations that can turn people from nowhere and nothing into multi-millionaires who can splurge on the house of their dreams. The obvious assumption that stems from this is that Des got her sportiness from her father, so perhaps that baseball bat the Knight wields isn't necessarily hers. Returning to more direct evidence, Rudy also has a fierce, potentially violently protective side that makes him a more believable candidate for the ruthless Knight than many may assume. His threats to beat people up are frequent, and while they're likely just exaggerations, when warning Susie not to hurt Noelle, he appears deathly serious, saying he was only kind of joking. This could hint at a legitimate strength that he would unleash without hesitation if his children were in danger. This would be consistent with a man willing to do whatever it took to find Des, willing to move fast and break things if there was even a chance he could locate his precious fawn and hear her play the guitar again. And on that matter, he didn't have much to lose. He's dying. Dialogue from the cancelled Undertale alarm clock app mentions Rudy and speaks of his death, implying that this illness will eventually claim his life, and he's very clearly in the late stages of that illness by the events of Deltarune. This could answer the question of why the conspiracy took so long to be put into motion in a way no other theories can. Des disappeared a long time back, potentially approaching a decade ago. Why is the Knight, if they're searching for Des, only going scorched earth now? The answer is that Rudy knows he may only have days to live. He's done being cautious. He's done with police work. He's making one last desperate push to bring Des back with every last ounce of strength, will, and determination he has left in his body. He wants to see her just one last time. He wants to die satisfied without feeling like a failure for what he was unable to stop. The roaring, as I've said numerous times, is a risk that the Knight was willing to take, rather than anything else, and Rudy, already stubborn, and now, out of time, is done letting risk stop him. He's almost found comfort in the fact that he's dying. He's come to terms with it. With nothing left to lose, he's been able to truly let loose in a way he hasn't before. Maybe that further explains the Knight's hammy attitude. The scene where the Knight laughs at Susie, it directly follows her accusing the Knight of staying in the dark world because they're too weak to face them in the light world. If she's saying this to Rudy, a cancer-ridden man, then this is the kind of thing he would find absolutely hilarious. She's right. She's clocked him, read him like a book, and she doesn't even know it. Also relating to Susie, if you play Chapter 4 without save data for Chapters 1 through 3, then Rudy will act coldly and cruelly towards Susie. You'll remember that the Knight's supposed animosity to Susie was previously used as evidence for Carol Knight. Under this interpretation, the normally jovial Rudy could be cold to her because he only knows her as someone who stubbornly stood in the way of his plan, the last-ditch effort plan that'll be the last thing he ever does. She's just a nuisance in this scenario, someone he'd hold no ill will toward if he knew her personally, but who has no way of comprehending just how much she's keeping him from. Rudy Knight just makes everything line up. When I was almost done with writing the script, I had a video by Kazoo Cat on in the background, and it made me start thinking about the conversation on the phone that Chris is a part of. There may in fact be two voices speaking in this conversation, as the red text seems to be discussing something completely different from the white text. If one of these voices is Carol, and the other voice can't be Asgore because he is actively peeing when it's taking place, then the other voice is almost certainly Rudy. He's the one speaking in red here. Carol's color palette consists of mostly blues, blue lipstick, blue nose, blue eyes, blue antlers, blue blazer. Rudy's color palette, meanwhile, consists mostly of reds. Red fur, red nose, red antlers, red pants, red flowers from Asgore. He's the fire to her ice. I don't want to fall down the rabbit hole that is Deltarune color theory, but color symbolism is used intentionally in the game, and I feel comfortable using it as additional supporting evidence here. Furthermore, it may not be a coincidence that red is the color most associated with determination, which the Knight is full to bursting with, and which Rudy would thus have in spades. Determination could potentially explain a few other key criticisms levied against Rudy Knight theory. The Knight is able to shapeshift, which is a power apparently unique to them and them alone. Determination, in Undertale, has been shown to be able to alter the shape of monsters, and monsters can natively produce enough determination to induce this change. Undyne the Undying is patient zero for this. Speaking of Undyne, the most convincing piece of evidence used against Rudy Knight is that the Knight is able to overpower Undyne and rush her to the shelter, when Rudy can hardly walk, hardly even stand. I have a couple of different explanations for this, one being that Rudy's determination in that moment gave him an extra burst of strength he wouldn't have had otherwise. Unused Shadow Crystal flavor text suggests that Undyne was frozen in ice, and we know from Birdly that frozen Lightners in the Dark World stay knocked out when returned to the Light World, meaning it's possible that Rudy froze Undyne before taking her out, and thus didn't have to contend with her fighting back as he rushed her to the shelter. It's additionally possible he passed her off to a partner immediately upon leaving the Dreamer household, likely Asgore, or that he even convinced Undyne to carry him the second they exited the Light World, since she probably wouldn't recognize him as the knight that was just attacking her. Or maybe she's in on it too, I'm truly not certain. But I don't believe this detail is enough to punch a hole in Rudy Knight theory, large enough to take the whole thing down. I also want to briefly touch on a supplementary theory to this one, that being that there are in fact two knights. In one of the visuals that is displayed when Ralsei is explaining the prophecy, you can see two figures flanking a titan who are extremely similar in design to the Roaring Knight. Two of them. And if one of them is Rudy Holiday, then the other one is likely to be Carol Holiday. There are two swords within the Holiday household after all, one specifically being Carol's, and a fellow named Chekhov gave us a very useful principle for writers to follow when putting weapons on the wall. It's even possible that we've already seen both of the Holiday parents in uniform. The Chapter 3 Knight is stoic and straight to business, dueling you personally with immense strength and skill, as well as acting possessive over Chris. The Chapter 4 Knight is hammy and having fun, sticking at a distance and never directly engaging with the fun gang. I wouldn't be shocked if it's eventually revealed that the Chapter 3 Knight was Carol, and the Chapter 4 Knight was Rudy, and future chapters feature them both. I know that all the evidence for there being two knights indicates their designs are or will be identical, but just for fun, I'll posit that Carol's knight design could be inverted, matching her white katana and recontextualizing the black katana in their room as specifically Rudy's. It also gives them perfectly dichotomous color schemes in the Dark World as well as in the Light World, blue and white versus red and black. But regardless of whether there are two knights, it's clear to me that the driving force behind the plot, the progenitor of the conflict, and the likely linchpins of its conclusion are the Holiday parents. Just as Undertale is a family affair, so too is Deltarune. The Holidays are a family in crisis. They have so much and yet feel so small. They're so strong and yet feel so weak. The Knight's conspiracy may seem bombastic and boisterous, the product of some kind of evil geniuses you'd see on TV, but it's a last-minute desperation ploy done out of terror and sorrow, driven by the exact kind of inability to let go that Deltarune warns us can have disastrous consequences. And to what end? Where's this leading? I've concocted an idea. Not a prediction. Just an idea, which I will henceforth let play out for you. Chapter 5 of Deltarune features the festival. It's interrupted by the Flower King Dark World, which features Chris, Susie, Ralsei, and likely Noelle and Birdly. Doing battle with Asgore in the fields of pink and gold. After that, they'll make their way to the festival to de-stress, to relax, to bond. Rudy is there. Carol is there. Carol organized it and wants to ensure it goes smoothly, and Rudy, health be damned, wasn't going to miss it for the world. The birds are singing, the flowers are blooming, the world is beautiful, life is beautiful. It is here that you get the required story encounter with Rudy I alluded to earlier. And, as many fans have predicted, he collapses. He's been pushing his body to the limits time and time again, getting reckless because he knows how little time he has left and just wants to enjoy these last few days and squeeze as much out of them as possible. Noelle is inconsolable. The whole town is aghast at the sight of the reindeer kneeling over Rudy, doing chest compressions, sobbing, wailing, while Carol stands to the side with her hand over her mouth and mascara-laden tears streaming down her cheeks. Chris and Susie rush up to assist. The sight is visceral. Rudy's slipping away before their very eyes. So too, it seems, in a different way, is Noelle, having lost her sister, having grown so distant from her mother that she must have lost her too, being lost in her own way in the terror that comes from all that and more. She can't lose Rudy. She can't, and she says that out loud over and over and over and over again. Screams it. I can't lose you. We then emerge in a dark world that was opened at that very moment. Anyone could have opened it. Noelle and Carol are my two primary suspects, but that part's not important. Nobody could bear this, and it just takes one to decide that they refuse to bear it, and drive their blade into the ground. A fountain outside would likely provoke the roaring. Titans everywhere. The dark world populated by terrified citizens caught in the middle of a dimensional unraveling that's beyond what they have the ability to comprehend. I want to say such a thing will occur, if it occurs, in Chapter 6, but Toby's Chapter 5 newsletter showcases what's definitively a Christmas tree, suggesting that the holiday's fingerprints will be all over at least a Dark World in this chapter. You'll remember that Dark Worlds reflect their creators. Regardless, the eventual climactic battle won't be against a Titan, not even against 5 of them. It'll be against Noelle never met the Knight. I sense this is why Noelle was narratively kept out of Chapters 3 and 4, despite her being set up as a core party member in Chapter 2, because if she met the Knight, she'd recognize them instantly. The face looking back at her is unmistakably her dad. He's alive. He's better than ever by his own assertion. She gleefully throws her arms around him and lets out a different kind of sob. Maybe Carol's also there, watching from afar, letting Noelle spend as much time as she wants with her father. This is it. There's no turning back. It's now or never. The parents will tell Noelle about what they've been doing, why they've been doing it, and how urgent their plan is. They have to find Des now, or they'll never get a chance again, for so many different reasons. The reason Carol doesn't say, not in front of Noelle at least, is that if this dark world closes, then Rudy's gone. Not lost, gone. They feel as Noelle feels. Empty. Empty without Des. The empty room, the empty house, the empty chair at the dinner table. The empty air without her and her crappy band doing scream metal in the garage. The emptiness in their hearts, in the world, in life, in earth, in everything. Why should they be forced to accept that? Life is cruel. It's oppressive. Fate is the worst, most despicable institution known to mankind. Why should they have to lay down and die? The holidays are a stubborn bunch. They don't go down easy. They don't go down at all. They demand what's theirs and they fight. They claw for it. Destiny doesn't want to go their way. Destiny is going to have to part for them as the Red Sea parted for Moses, whether it likes it or not. Meanwhile, the heroes fight their way through the Dark World, and eventually they reach them, the holidays. And as the confrontation becomes more and more inevitable, as the heroes beckon for Noelle to stay away from the Knight, as the reality sets in as to who the Knight truly is, barbs are exchanged, reality crashes back in, the realization dawns on everyone. For one side, the true nature of the Knight's plan. For the other side, what the consequences will truly be if the fountain isn't closed, and what the consequences will truly be if it is. Noelle, sweet Noelle, who's lost more than anyone, who needs the hope, the escape the Dark Worlds provide more than anyone, who here now is holding onto her family with a clenched fist, knowing that the second the sunlight returns to her life, the rest of the light will have faded. She can't let that happen. Everyone else says that the world will be destroyed if the fountain isn't closed. Noelle retorts that if it is, her world would be destroyed. She's not thinking straight. She's blinded by all the emotions nobody should ever have to feel. And in the chaos, a battle commences. Chris, Susie, and Ralsei. Maybe Birdley in his place, or in addition to him, depending on if Toby wants to give him a proper arc, against Rudy, Carol, and Noelle. If nothing else is true about Holiday Requiem, let this be its most authoritative statement. Late game Deltarune will feature a battle with Noelle Holiday, who will side with her family over Chris and the Fun Gang, at the ends of the earth, for the fate of the universe, for the lives of Des, Rudy, and everyone else. Perhaps this battle will be alongside one Knight, two Knights, Rudy Knight, Carol Knight, Des Knight, whatever the case. All of the Holiday's involvement in the plot, and the plot itself, I assert, will have been building to this moment. This is an assertion I make mostly based on my reading of Deltarune's themes, but it's supported narratively as well, given Noelle's angel imagery, and how Rousey's explanation of the prophecy foretells of the roaring being followed by a confrontation with the angel. One odd thematic thread woven throughout many of Deltarune's chapters is Dragon Blazers. It's an RPG we later learn is based on the prophecy. It's what we are supposedly playing in Chapter 3, given how it's been previously described as having an ice palace and an evil root. The game in Chapter 3 thus reflects reality, Deltarune's past and likely future, meaning it, and Dragon Blazers broadly, can be used to predict future plot beats. Noelle states at one point that the mage left the party. This is presumed to be Ralse, as she states that the mage has access to the ability Fire Shock, and Ralse is implied to have fire-based magic. But in the weird route, it appears the mage also has an ability called Ice Shock. Ice Shock is the name of a spell Noelle can use, and the game in Chapter 3 features a prominent ice mage who is a clear analog to Noelle. Perhaps the mage leaving the party could just reference Noelle's absence in Chapters 3 and 4, but perhaps it could also be foreshadowing this moment, where Noelle's not just left your party, she's left your side entirely. This battle will be difficult, not just in terms of the gameplay, what's directly before you, but also what the game is forcing you to confront thematically. I once had a friend who couldn't ever accept the notion that pain and loss are essential to life. They preached up until the day I lost contact with them that were they given the ability, they'd push a button and just pause life now, pause time now, as it is. No one ever dies. No one ever grows older. Nothing ever changes. Pain should just be unilaterally exterminated with prejudice. I never agreed with them, but there's an argument that philosophically, we only tell ourselves that death gives life its beauty, that love and loss are two sides of the same coin, because we can't imagine an alternative and need a way to cope with that. We're never going to be able to escape death, loss, pain, hatred, evil, what have you. So may as well make peace with it. What else are you gonna do? DELTARUNE asks, if there were a way to escape it, would you still want to make peace with it? And is it moral to impose whatever your decision is on others? The escapism here is literal. The darkness can resurrect the dead, but it also asks the question metaphorically. What is the morality of escapism rather than letting life be as painful as it is joyous? What is the morality of stripping escapism away from others and forcing that pain back onto them? The battle between the Fun Gang and the Holidays would be a battle between reality and escapism, between death and life in a sense, and you would be playing as death. Deltarune's themes have always been poignant and powerful, but it's in this battle where the game would truly begin to practice what it was preaching. You know the game is telling you that escapism can be dangerous, and you know that you're playing this game as escapism. And now is when you're forced to set your cognitive dissonance aside to truly face that. If the Holidays are facing you because they can't let go, defeating them means making them let go. It means proving the value of letting go. It means letting go yourself. I imagine this scene playing out differently in the Weird Route. I imagine that at some point before this, the soul will have taken control of Noelle rather than Chris. This is foreshadowed by the not yet available Twisted Sword, exclusive to the Weird Route, loosening Chris's trance modifier in the game files, and by Spamton outright promising freedom for Chris by engaging in the Weird Route. And in addition, the detail I mentioned about the mage leaving the party in Dragon Blazers? In the Weird Route, it appears that the mage remains. Noelle, when playing Dragon Blazers in the Weird Route, confidently uses the spell that she previously said she couldn't use without the mage. This is further reason to believe that the mage leaving the party isn't in reference to Noelle not being in Chapters 3 and 4. This implies that the Weird Route will feature Noelle being in our party in a scene that she's not in the normal route. I believe this battle will be that scene, and that we'll be playing as her during it. I also sometimes imagine Chris, freed from the soul, having run to Rudy and Carol for help, and Noelle, losing sight of her friends and even her own family in furtherance of getting stronger and obeying the wishes of the soul. Battle against Chris and the Holidays. The Fun Gang may be joining her after Chris's true allegiances have been revealed. This manifestation could be supported by another detail from Dragon Blazers. Rudy is a fan of Dragon Blazers and is guiding Noelle's gameplay when we see them playing together in the normal route. In the Weird Route, though, Noelle defies him to make her own choices. If Rudy is the knight, the one driving the plot of Deltarune, this scene implies that in the Weird Route, Noelle will hijack the plot and in doing so turn against Rudy, the knight. Fate. The specifics aren't truly that important. What's important is that in the Weird Route, escapism is going to prevail. Noelle is going to prevail. If the Weird Route is a subversion of the prophecy, then the climactic battle concluding in the Angel's victory would be a subversion of that and then so much more. After all, this is the route where we've made Noelle stronger, less afraid. Here we see why such a thing is capable of flipping the prophecy on its head. The weird route was done as an escape from the plot. Why should it not end escaping from the themes as well, acting as their antithesis? The weird route was done out of curiosity, out of the primal part of the brain that seeks fun, completionism, what have you, regardless of whether such escapes are just. Those feelings will win the day in the weird route, and the world will be plunged into darkness because of it. And I still think a lot of people would prefer that. Everything's visible in the light. Everything. Nothing can hide in the light. Nothing can be escaped in the light. There's a poet I really liked when I was younger, James Carter. He writes specifically poems for children, poems not lacking in meaning, but being simpler, easier reads, that don't challenge you as much. He was my favorite poet when life was more innocent, and he's got a poem I still revisit to this day. The dark. Why are we so afraid of the dark? It doesn't bite and doesn't bark, or chase old ladies round the park, or steal your sweeties for a lark. And though it might not let you see, it lets you have some privacy, and gives you time to go to sleep, provides a place to hide or weep. It cannot help but be around when beastly things make beastly sounds, when back doors slam and windows creak, when cats have fights and voices shriek. The dark is cozy, still and calm, and never does you any harm. In the loft, below the sink, it's somewhere nice and quiet to think. Deep in the cupboards, pockets too, it's always lurking out of view. Why won't it come out till it's night? Perhaps the dark's afraid of light.